At 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN.
The Warren Commission released its report on the Kennedy assassination 40 years ago. In September, the Assassination Archives and Research Center hosted a symposium on the Commission's findings. Next is David Talbot, editor of Salon.com. He spoke about the response to the Warren report at the time of its release. This is about an hour.
Please take their seats. Our first speaker this afternoon is David Talbot of Salon.com, who is going to speak to us about what the high and the mighty thought about the Kennedy assassination. Thanks, Jim, and thank you to all the organizers of this conference. As a relative newcomer to this fascinating world, I've been learning a lot. I can't pass myself off as an expert, as all the other speakers have been. You won't hear anything from me about mock banding or bullet-lead analysis. Maybe that's a relief after. But I am working on a book that I think has relevance to some of the work that's being done, and I'd love to hear from all of you. I'm going to be giving a talk that's based on an article that I recently wrote and published in Salon. Some of you might have seen it, but I'll be going off script a number of times if you have read it, and I would like to have a dialogue with some of you about this. I'm fascinated by this question, of course, about what the people in government, the political elite themselves, thought about the crime of the century. I think the conference is well-timed, of course, because once again we find ourselves in the season of the official report. The 9/11 Commission report, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, the Schlesinger inquiry on Abu Ghraib, among others. And once again the official version is under fire. The 9/11 report, of course, has been attacked for leaning over backwards in the spirit of bipartisan unanimity to avoid pinning blame on the Bush administration for its casual attitude towards terrorist alerts before the calamity and for sidestepping the issue of Saudi involvement. But at least it's won a measure of public respect due in large part to the vigilance of 9/11 victims' families. And when it comes to government inquiries, I think this is the key, the extent to which the public is involved. The Senate report on the intelligence failures leading to the Iraq War has not fared as well, of course, undoubtedly because it lacked the same public oversight. This report went to even greater extremes to keep Bush out of the crosshairs. As Thomas Powers recently wrote in the New York Review of Books, no tyrannical father presiding over an intimidated household was ever tiptoed around with greater caution than as the figure of President George W. Bush in the committee's FAT report. And the Schlesinger report on Abu Ghraib has quickly earned itself an utterly contemptuous response, eliciting widespread outrage for giving Defense Secretary Rumsfeld and the Pentagon a sweeping pass on the reign of torture at the prison. So it is only appropriate in this stormy season of the official version and its discontents that we observe the 40th anniversary of the Warren Report, the mother of all such controversies. The vast 26-volume report was, of course, delivered to by Chief Justice Earl Warren to President Johnson on September 24, 1964. And as we know, the Warren Report concluded that President Kennedy was the victim of a lone, unstable assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, who was, of course, conveniently gunned down 2 days later by Jack Ruby. The Warren Commission, itself the victim of massive fraud and manipulation by the FBI and CIA, came under immediate fire from critics, with its report being denounced as a government cover-up by a growing army of independent researchers. Some of course, are with us at the conference. History has not been any kinder to the Warren Report, which has been derided and condemned by everyone from the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the only other federal panel to exhaustively probe Kennedy's murder, and which found in 1979 that the president was the probable target of a conspiracy, to Oliver Stone in his explosive 1991 film, JFK, to the History Channel, which routinely airs even the outer limits of conspiracy theories. 4 decades later, the Warren Report is widely regarded as whitewash, with polls consistently showing the majority of Americans reject the official version of Kennedy's death. But there is one sanctuary where the Warren Report is still stubbornly upheld, and where its manifold critics can expect their own rough treatment. And that's in the towers of the media elite, my profession. Fresh from assaulting Oliver Stone not only for his film but for his very character, and let me step aside to say this is an assault that I have engaged in the past also, attacking the film JFK. And I know David Rowan yesterday said that he found, I think 90%, was it David, of the film to be an error. Whatever its merits as a historical document, and of course it can't be reviewed as a documentary, I do think now, looking back over a dozen years later, that the film has had, I would say, a positive impact in the American debate. It, of course, resulted in the release of thousands of documents that many of you are using for your own research. And I find that there was an emotional truth in that film, not unlike perhaps Don DeLillo's excellent novel Libra and James Elroy's novel American Tabloid. So it's my feeling that Oliver Stone has to be read, as he is, as a fiction filmmaker. But I certainly think he opened the debate in a useful way. In any case, the media elite, of course, were all over Oliver Stone, and shortly thereafter rushed to embrace Gerald Posner's book, Case Closed, in 1993, making that book a bestseller. The most convincing explanation of the assassination, historian Robert Dalla called it in the Boston Globe. And the 40th anniversary of the assassination in Dallas last November, of course, sparked a new cannonade of anti-conspiracy sound and fury in the media, with ABC's Peter Jennings leading the way this time, making yet another network news attempt to silence the report's critics. Now, most of the press lords and pundits, of course, from the 1960s who allowed themselves to be convinced that the Warren Report was the correct version of what happened in Dallas, whether because they genuinely believed it or because they thought it was for the good of the country, are now dead or retired. But after buying the official version for so long, it seems that the elite media have too much invested in the Warren Report to change their minds now, even if they're under new editorial leadership. I'll be interested to see how much coverage the Warren Report's anniversary, for instance, does get in the coming week. One of the great ironies of history, however, is that while the media elite was busily trying to shore up public confidence in the Warren Report, the country's political elite was privately confiding among themselves that the report was a travesty, a fairy tale for mass consumption. Presidents, White House aides, intelligence officials, senators, congressmen, even foreign leaders, they all muttered darkly among themselves that Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy, a plot that a number of them suspected had roots in the U.S. government itself. Now, to be fair, some high media dignitaries themselves also quietly shared their doubts about the official version. In 1993, CBS anchorman, who's in trouble again, Dan Rather, reportedly confided to Robert Tannenbaum, the former deputy chief counsel of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, quote, "We really blew it on the Kennedy assassination." Thanks to tapes of White House conversations that have been released to the public in recent years, we now know that the man who appointed the Warren Commission, President Lyndon Johnson, did not believe its conclusions. On September 18th, as we've heard at the conference, 1964, the last day the panel met, Commission member Senator Richard Russell phoned Johnson, his old political protege, to tell him he did not believe the single bullet theory, the key to the Commission's finding that Oswald acted alone. "I don't either," Johnson told him. I'll defer to Max Holland, who of course is with us. as the expert on these tapes and LBJ's, of course, private opinions about what happened in Dallas. And I'm halfway through Max's book, and as I've told him, I find it very useful. And again, I want to say that I know there's differences of opinion here, and I've already complimented Jim Lazar on, in the spirit of, I think, open inquiry, inviting people with different opinions about what happened in Dallas to be here today and this weekend. In any case, we do know that LBJ had differing views than that of the Warren Commission on the assassination. He seemed to fix on Castro and Cuba as the source of the plot. It weighed heavily on him throughout his term in office. And Max, I just had lunch with Max, and I pointed out how intriguing this particular statement in his book was. He ends his introduction, Max does, in his new book, saying that it's virtually an article of faith among historians that the war in Vietnam was the overwhelming reason the president left office in 1969, a war-embittered and disillusioned man. Yet the assassination-related tapes paint a more nuanced portrait, one in which Johnson's view of the assassination weighing as heavily on him as did the war. Now, critics of the Warren Report were often, critics of the Warren Report's lone assassination conclusion were often stumped by defenders of the report with a question: if there was a conspiracy, why didn't President Kennedy's own brother, Bobby, the Attorney General of the United States, do anything about it? And all of us who know American presidential history know that there was probably never another brother act in American politics or government like the Kennedy brothers, that they were uniquely close, that Bobby was the tough, aggressive protector of the Kennedy family and of his brother in particular, and that if anyone would have done anything to get to the bottom of what happened to his brother in Dallas, it would have been Bobby Kennedy. So why didn't he, at least publicly, do something about it? And it is true that at least until shortly before his own death in June 1968, Bobby Kennedy publicly supported the Warren Report. On March 25th, during a presidential campaign rally at San Fernando Valley State College in California, now called Cal State Northridge, Kennedy was dramatically confronted by a woman heckler who called out, "We want to know who killed President Kennedy." Kennedy responded by saying, "I stand by the Warren Commission report." I think, he says. It's an interesting tape if you listen to it. And then he says, everything will come out in the end. I've seen what's in the archives, everything will come out. But at a later campaign appearance, days before his assassination, according to his former press spokesman, Frank Mankiewicz, who I've interviewed several times, Bobby Kennedy said the opposite. When asked if he would reopen the investigation into his brother's death, he uttered a simple one-word answer: yes. Mankiewicz recalls today, quote, "I remember that I was stunned by the answer. It was either like he was suddenly blurting out the truth, or it was a way to shut down the question. You know, yes, now let's move on." Bobby's public statements on the Warren Report were obviously freighted with political and emotional and perhaps even security concerns for himself. But we have no doubt what his private opinion of the report was. As his biographer, Evan Thomas, wrote, Kennedy regarded the Warren Commission as a public relations exercise to reassure the public, end quote. According to a variety of reports, Kennedy immediately suspected a plot as soon as he heard his brother had been shot in Dallas. And as he made calls and inquiries in the hours and days after the assassination, he came to an ominous conclusion. His brother was the victim of a domestic political conspiracy. In a remarkable passage that I'm sure a number of you are familiar with, but not the public at large, unfortunately, in the book One Hell of a Gamble, the widely praised 1997 history of the Cuban Missile Crisis based on declassified Soviet and U.S. government documents, historians Alexander Fursenko and Timothy Naftali wrote that on November 29th, 1 week after the assassination, Bobby dispatched a close family friend named William Walton to Moscow with a remarkable message for Georgy Bolshakov, the KGB agent who Bobby had come to trust during the nerve-wracking back-channel negotiations during the missile crisis. According to these historians, Walton told Bolshakov that Bobby and Jacqueline Kennedy believed, quote, there was a large political conspiracy behind Oswald's rifle, and, quote, that Dallas was the ideal location for such a crime. The Kennedys also sought to reassure the Soviets that despite Oswald's apparent connections to the communist world, they believed President Kennedy had been killed by American enemies. This is a stunning account, of course, with the fallen president's brother and widow communicating their chilling suspicions privately to the preeminent world rival of the U.S. And it does not receive nearly the public attention or scholarly inquiry it deserves. Both Khrushchev, who had been working with JFK to ease tensions between the superpowers, and his spy chief shared Kennedy's dark view of the assassination. KGB Chairman Vladimir Semyonov reacted incredulously to the news that Oswald, a man whom his agency had closely monitored during Oswald's stay in the Soviet Union, was the culprit. I thought this man could not possibly be the mastermind of the crime, the KGB chairman was quoted as saying. And according to Pursenko and Naftali, intelligence coming to Khrushchev in the weeks following the assassination seemed to confirm the theory that a right-wing conspiracy had killed Kennedy, an assessment that was shared by the governments of Cuba, Mexico, and France, where President de Gaulle, when briefed by a reporter on the lone nut theory, reacted with Gallic skepticism, laughing, "You're kidding me, cowboys and Indians." In the years after his brother's death, Bobby Kennedy was overwhelmed by a grief that was beyond grief. But the common perception that he found it too painful to focus on the assassination is simply not the case. My own research has shown that during the years between his brother's death and his own death, he dispatched a number of surrogates, including Mankiewicz, his press spokesman, Walter Sheridan, his trusted investigator who worked with him on the Jimmy Hoffa investigation, Ed Guthman, who had been his spokesman at the Justice Department and later became editor of the New York Times, and John Siegenthaler, another journalist who had worked with him closely over the years, to check out their work, the work of assassination critics, Jim Garrison among others. In fact, Kennedy himself phoned New Orleans coroner Nicholas Chetta at his home after the death of key Garrison suspect David Ferry to question Chetta about his autopsy report on Ferry. And while Sheridan, a trusted friend of Kennedy's who had worked closely with him, as I said, on the Hoffa investigation, famously repudiated Garrison in a 1967 documentary for NBC, RFK apparently still kept ties to the Garrison camp even after this. According to William Turner, a former FBI agent who worked as a Garrison investigator on the Kennedy case, in April 1968, Garrison's office, that is Turner, received a call in New Orleans from an RFK campaign aide named Richard Lubick. He said, "Bill, Bobby's going to go. He's going to reopen the investigation after he wins." I went in immediately and told Garrison. He didn't seem surprised. Now, Cy Hirsch, among others, who I, of course, have great respect for, in his book, which takes a very dark view, of course, of the Kennedy dynasty, The Dark Side of Camelot, says emphatically that Bobby never would have opened the assassination if he had lived and been elected president, because of the skeletons that he was afraid would have come tumbling out, the CIA, the mafia, the women, etc. But it's my feeling from the research I've done that I think Bobby was grappling towards a strategy that he would put in, that he would implement once he was elected president. And that the closer he actually got to the White House and he thought it was more likely he would have the power to reopen the inquiry, I think it became more and more of an issue for him, emotionally and politically. But I'm convinced he was headed in that direction. Now, Bobby, of course, was not the only member of President Kennedy's inner circle who believed there was a conspiracy. Presidential aides Kenny O'Donnell and Dave Powers, who were members of JFK's Irish Mafia, were in a trailing limousine in the Dallas motorcade. Both of them later told House Speaker Tip O'Neill that they heard 2 shots from behind the fence on the grassy knoll. "That's not what you told the Warren Commission," a stunned O'Neill replied, according to his 1989 memoir, Man of the House. "You're right," said O'Donnell. I told the FBI what I had heard, but they said it couldn't have happened that way and that I must have been imagining things. So not wanting to, quote, stir up more pain and trouble for the family, O'Donnell told the commission what the FBI wanted him to. Blunt's skepticism about the Warren Report was a bipartisan affair, with leaders on both sides of the aisle airily dismissing its conclusions. We know that President Nixon was a skeptic. One of his top aides, White House Chief of Staff H.R. Bob Haldeman, shared his boss's skepticism. In his own 1978 memoir, The Ends of Power, Haldeman wrote that he'd always been intrigued with the conflicting theories about the assassination. And he recalls that when the Nixon team finally moved into the White House, he felt that they, quote, would now be in a position to get all the facts, end quote. But Nixon, perhaps wary of where all those facts would lead, rejected Haldeman's suggestion. According to Haldeman, Nixon did play the assassination card in a mysterious way, however, against CIA Director Richard Helms, long regarded by some Warren Report critics to have knowledge about the gunshots in Dallas. Seeking to pressure the CIA into helping him out of his Watergate mess, Nixon had Haldeman deliver this cryptic message, apparently a threat of some sort to Helms. Quote, "The President asked me to tell you this entire Watergate affair may be connected to the Bay of Pigs, and if it opens up, the Bay of Pigs may be blown." This is what Haldeman told Helms in a meeting. This prompted an explosive reaction from the CIA spy master. "Turmoil in the room," Haldeman writes in his book. "Helms gripping the arms of his chair, leaning forward and shouting, 'The Bay of Pigs had nothing to do with this. I have no concern about the Bay of Pigs.'" Haldeman speculates that the Bay of Pigs must have been Nixon's code for something related to the CIA, Castro, and the Kennedy assassination. But whatever dark card Nixon had played, it worked. According to Haldeman, he reported back to his boss that the CIA director was now suddenly very happy to be helpful. Nixon was not willing to publicly reopen the box of assassination demons, but many of them began flying out when the Church Committee began investigating CIA abuses in the 1970s, including the unholy pact between the agency and the mafia to eliminate Fidel Castro. Among those in Washington who were particularly curious about the revelations that were coming out about the CIA and the Kennedy assassination was George Bush Sr. As Kitty Kelly observes in her new book about the Bush family, while serving as the CIA director in the Ford administration, Bush fired off a series of memos in fall 1978 asking subordinates in the agency various questions about Oswald, Ruby, Helms, and other figures tied to the assassination. Quoting from Kitty's new book, "Years later, when Bush became president of the United States, he would deny making any attempt to review the agency files on the JFK assassination. When he made this claim, he did not realize that the agency would release 18 documents under the Freedom of Information Act that showed he had indeed, as CIA director, requested information not once but several times on a wide range of questions surrounding the Kennedy assassination." One of the most aggressive investigators on the Church Committee was the young, ambitious Democratic senator from Colorado, Gary Hart, who, along with his Republican colleague, Richard Schweiker of Pennsylvania, began digging into the swampy murk of southern Florida in the early 1960s. Here, of course, was the steamy nursery for plots that drew together CIA saboteurs, mafia assassins, anti-communist Cuban fanatics, and the whole array of patriotic zealots who were determined to overthrow the Cuban government, the Iraq of its day. Gary Hart, in an interview with me, said, "The whole atmosphere down there in Florida at the time was so yeasty, I don't think anybody, Helms or anybody, had control of the thing. There were people clandestinely meeting people, the mafia connections, the friendships between the mafia and the CIA agents, and this crazy Cuban exile community. There were more and more layers, and it was honeycombed with bizarre people. I don't think anybody knew everything that was going on, and I think the Kennedys were kind of racing to keep up with it all." End quote from Gary Hart. Schweiker's mind was blown by what he and Hart were digging up. There's no other way to describe it. Here was a moderate Republican from Pennsylvania, and he would be later chosen, of course, as vice presidential running mate briefly by Ronald Reagan in 1976, to bolster his challenge against President Ford. But Schweiker's faith in the American government seemed deeply shaken by his Kennedy probe, which convinced him, quote, the fingerprints of intelligence were all over Lee Harvey Oswald. Gary Hart told me, quote, Dick made a lot of statements inside the committee at the time that were a lot more inflammatory than anything I ever said in terms of his suspicions about who killed Kennedy. He would say, this is outrageous. We've got to open this up. We've got to reopen it. He was a blowtorch. Hart, too, concluded that Kennedy was likely killed by a conspiracy involving some feverish cabal from the swamps of anti-Castro zealotry. And when he ran for president in 1984, Hart says, whenever he was asked about the assassination, quote, my consistent response was based on my church committee experience, there are sufficient doubts about the case to justify reopening the files of the CIA, particularly in its relationship to the mafia, end quote. This was enough to blow other people's minds, says Hart, including remnants of the mafia family Florida godfather Santo Trafficante, who plays a key role in many JFK conspiracy theories. What Gary Hart then told me was, journalist Cy Hirsch told me that he interviewed buddies of Trafficante, including his right-hand man, who was still alive when Hirsch wrote his book, The Dark Side of Camelot. He didn't put this in his book, but when my name came up, Gary Hart's name, the guy laughed, he snorted and said, we don't think he's any better than the Kennedys. End quote from Gary Hart. I asked Senator Hart, you meant that they were keeping an eye on you as well? At the very least, said Gary Hart, this was in the 1980s when I was running for president, saying I would reopen the Kennedy investigation. Anybody can draw their own conclusions, end quote. Hart, of course, never made it to the White House, but another politician who had been deeply inspired by JFK, William Jefferson Clinton, did. And like perhaps every other man has moved into the White House following the Kennedy assassination, he too was curious about finding out the real story of Dallas. Where are the Kennedy files? The young president reportedly asked soon after he went to work in the Oval Office. And what about that other JFK from Massachusetts who also met President Kennedy as a young man, John F. Kerry? If he's elected in November, will he be tempted to launch an inquiry and try to find out what really happened to his hero in Dallas? Hart says he doubts it. You almost had to go through it like I did with the church committee, he told me, and get all the context. Otherwise, you have to be very careful about falling into the conspiracy category. I at least had some credentials to talk about it. But if Kerry were to bring it up, people would just say, he's wacky, he's obsessive. As Hart observes, there are other ways to kill a leader these days. You can assassinate his character. And so, 40 years after the Warren Report, with the country's political elite still racked with suspicions about the Kennedy assassination, and yet immobilized from doing anything about it by fears of being politically marginalized, and with the media elite continuing to disdain even the most serious journalistic inquiry, the crime seems frozen in place. It is now up to historians and scholars and authors to keep the spirit of inquiry alive. For decades, the only public critics of the Warren Report was a heroic and indomitable band of citizen investigators, including a crusading New York attorney, a small-town Texas newspaperman, a retired Washington civil servant, a Berkeley literature professor, a Los Angeles sign salesman, a Pittsburgh coroner, all of whom refused to accept the fraud that was perpetrated on the American people. Undaunted by the media scorn that was heaped on them, they devoted their lives to what powerful government officials and high-paid media mandarins should have been doing: solving the most shocking crime against American democracy in the 20th century. Their names: Mark Lane, Ray Marcus, Harold Weisberg, Sylvia Meagher, Vincent Salandria, Mary Farrell, Penn Jones Jr., Cyril Wecht, Josiah Tink Thompson, Peter Dale Scott, David Rohn, Jim Lazard, Gayton Fonzie, among others. These names will find their honored place in American history. It's these everyday heroes and their successors, many of whom are here today as well, whose best work will someday come to replace the heavy and, I feel, counterfeit tomes of the Warren Report. Thank you. I'll take some questions, but as they say, I can't get into the physical evidence. Tink?
If I could, I'd like to offer you some information.
Sure.
With regard to the media in the years shortly after the assassination. I was hired by Life magazine in the fall of 1966.
Speak up.
I'll go up. I think this genuinely has some relevance, and we would have talked privately about this later, but why not share it with everyone else? I was hired by Life in October of 1966, and together with Dick Billings and Ed Kern, two very excellent editors of Life, we ran an investigation which ended up with the first major break in the hegemony of Warren Commission apologies. That was an issue of Life which put on the cover grounds for reasonable doubt. And it was the first fissure in the...
I think Andy has copies of that. I bought one yesterday.
Is that right? Well, it was the first fissure in the media's sort of total acceptance of the Warren Report. Now, during that investigation, I was hired simply for time reasons. They could have trained up Billings or Kern or anyone in 4 months' time to get where I was. They didn't have the time. So they permitted me to tell them where the bodies were buried, to identify the witnesses, the places, the issues, the questions. And I got to say, I had absolutely total support. There were no questions about should we interview X or Y or anything like that. There was no control on this investigation whatsoever. It went wherever it wanted to go, and it went as far as we could go. It was unlimited. Now, I also have to say that the article that was published was clearly much blander, much thinner than the information that we had. Now, various people will tell you that Life magazine is an organism of the elite and etc. It had to be controlled from above, and that's why the article did not include everything we had. That's nonsense. There was no control from above. George Hunt, the editor of Life, supported this completely. We had journalists who were completely committed to it and were running it as hard as we could. Well, why did that happen? Well, it happened due to a kind of, I think, institutional defect at Life. Life suffered from what might be called committee journalism at that time. In terms of any major story published by Life would have had to be signed off on by at least 10 different people. The result of that institutional defect was that any story on any issue would be somewhat watered down. This had nothing to do with the Kennedy assassination. It had to do with the way Life did business at that time. And I suspect that something like that was endemic in all the media. In other words, too many people had to sign off on something in order for anything to be really, really hard-edged, etc., etc. Now, what happened? That issue came out in, I think, late November 1966. During the next month or so, the investigation sort of trailed off into nowhere. Why was that? Was it because the investigation was controlled from above? No. The reason the investigation ended at Life, and by the way, we knew when we were working at Life that the New York Times had a 12-man investigation.
Under Harrison Salisbury.
Right, in the field.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And we never met them, we never knew what they were doing, but we knew they were digging. Right. I think that investigation trailed off for two significant reasons. One was that in January of 1967, through the grapevine of these critics that you mentioned, David, I learned of the Garrison investigation. I told Dick Billings about that Garrison investigation. He flew to New Orleans and basically signed up Garrison to an exclusive contract with Life for the coverage of this investigation. So I think at that point, by January, Billings certainly felt, hey, something really big is going on here. We've got it. I've signed it up. So let's just follow that. There's another significant reason, though, and before we start kicking the media, I think we got to recognize this. We couldn't take it all the way at that point, right? We couldn't solve the crime. So at a certain point in these matters, in the Kennedy assassination, you end up with this level, with this strata of ambiguity, which does not permit you, if you're a media editor, to mount a big, terrific breakthrough story. In other words, we couldn't break it. And that really is the simple answer. Now, many people have accused me of being a CIA agent because I worked for Time Life.
Is it true?
For a few months.
You can deny it right now.
Yeah, I deny it. Okay. And have claimed that Life magazine, through very complicated relationships, was basically a CIA front. This, of course, is absolute nonsense. I mean, any journalist at that time in 1966 would have given their left arm to break through on this case. And everybody at Life, we had the same notion. We had the thought that maybe, if we got lucky, and if we looked in the right place, and if we pulled the right thread, that we really could break it. And I think that's the case throughout. Let me mention only one other thing. CBS. CBS has put together a series of documentaries on this case beginning very early. I know there was one in 1967 that I want to particularly mention. These were basically apologias for the Warren Commission report. Even there, you find the journalists who were actually working on the stories, right, were enthusiastic, wanted to break through, et cetera, et cetera. Bob Richter, for example, leaked to me the actual raw data on the firing tests, which showed just the opposite from what CBS finally broadcast. So I think if one's going to deal with the media, one has to recognize that the working journalists who do the day-to-day work within these institutions are as committed, have been as committed to a breakthrough in this case as anyone. And I still don't believe that any of these journalists are controlled from above in some sort of major conspiracy. The basic problem these journalists, committed journalists as they are, have had from the very beginning is that they couldn't bring about a breakthrough, that this case is really recalcitrant. The evidence in this case, and that's why we're sitting here today, the evidence in this case remains fundamentally recalcitrant to any single interpretation. So I just wanted to...
Okay, thanks, Ting. Yeah, let me, without getting too, I know we're going to have a discussion about media tomorrow, which should cover some of this ground, so I won't go too farther into it. I take your point, Tink. I'm a little, though, skeptical about the decisions, having been in the media all of my life now, worked for various organizations. Where are those decisions made? If the working journalists want to keep pushing, where are the decisions made at what level to cut off that process? And speaking of the New York Times investigation, there was a great story done that Ray Marcus just sent me, actually, in Rolling Stone in the 1970s, I believe, mid-70s, about the media coverage of the assassination, and went into that New York Times team investigation led by managing editor Harrison Salisbury. And they quoted 2 or 3 of the reporters who were on that team, and at least one of them said, we were getting good stuff. And then somehow the plug got pulled. And they didn't know why or where, but he felt, at least this one reporter, as I recall, beat reporter for the New York Times, that they were coming up with good stuff, and somehow the plug got pulled. Anyway, yes, over here.
When you look at a question like the lead opinion, you ought to look in both directions to see if elites supported the Warren Commission. Did you find elite support for the Warren Commission, and did you find a pattern in who was likely to support it and who was likely to criticize it? Is there an ideological bias at work here?
As I said, I found bipartisan skepticism on both sides of the aisle. I think among the critics and the elite of the Warren Report, I think the ideology comes to where they think the conspiracy lay. Do you think it was Castro? Do you think it was the anti-Castro Cubans and the CIA? I think that's where the ideological divide that I most often see. Yes, of course, there were a number of people who have continued to support the Warren Report, at least publicly, but I don't know what their private feelings were. These are the people I mentioned today were the ones that I know who have been documented as privately expressing their skepticism. Someone else might be able to say here, people who firmly believed in the Warren Report inside government, who had some inside knowledge about the Warren Report. But I can't tell you right now. The woman right here?
I just want to say that I've been to many of the conferences in Dallas. I'm a native of Dallas. I saw the motorcade, not the assassination, but the motorcade on the 22nd, and have followed this avidly for the past at least decade. And one person that definitely deserves to be noted among the critics is John Judge, who has convened the meetings year after year in Dallas, where the people who have come to those, many in this room, I feel they have solved the assassination. It's like a huge jigsaw puzzle. People have been bringing their pieces to the table and putting them on there. They've been finding the pieces of the puzzle lost under the floorboards and bringing them forward. And I think it's been solved. And it's very complex. You have to read and dig and listen to the witnesses. Many, as we all know, scores of people have been killed, witnesses, early on. So I just do want to add John Judge's name to your list and ask that work be acknowledged, that teamwork.
Thank you. And I knew when I made that list, again, I'm a newcomer to the whole research area here on this subject, and I knew I was going to leave some people off, and my apologies to anyone I did who has been doing important work in this field. Yes, over here.
I don't have it with me, but Gary Hart also had a long paragraph in a book, I think, called The Right Stuff, that he wrote that indicated strongly that he believed there was a larger force operating behind the conspiracy. It didn't say it in so many words, but it said it in between the lines. And I'm wondering about what you were reading between the lines in your recent, was it, interview with him?
Yes, it was.
Was he telling you, or did he seem to be wanting to tell you that maybe the Donna Rice incident had something to do with his... that was an anonymous phone call.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question. I mean, clearly he was saying that, as he told me, that you can stop a political figure who's troublesome nowadays without a bullet. And I can't comment on the Donna Rice, scandal. That clearly did end his presidential hopes. I just can't go there. But it's a good question.
Did you hear anything in what he had said to you that was going toward that?
I just can't comment on that. He did tell me some things, and he asked for some things to be off the record. What I quoted him here was what he wanted to be quoted on the record as saying.
That's interesting.
Yes, right here.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thanks for coming. You brought up President Clinton's intrigue into the case. I just want to know, since his 8 years in office, what were his contributions and accomplishments of anything of bringing out the case?
That's a very good question, and I knew I would be asked that. All I know about Clinton and his suspicions or curiosity, maybe it's just simple curiosity about the assassination, I just reported to you. It came from a Clinton aide. I can't tell you who it is. Again, it was off the record. but I found it intriguing. That was one of the first things that Bill Clinton was curious about.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I think if you check the Deputy Attorney General Hubble in his book indicates that when he was appointed to his position that Clinton asked him to find out about two things, one of which was the Kennedy assassination and the other was flying saucers.
The FBI was seeking to stonewall the release of documents, and they had a huge tussle. And Clinton, rather than standing with the FBI, forced him into negotiations and ultimately gently nudged the FBI to release documents, particularly because the FBI kept saying that by releasing this information it would compromise sources and methods. The review board found a New York Times article that, in fact, the FBI's own study showed that it didn't compromise sources and methods to do the kind of releasing they were doing. And ultimately the decision was for disclosure. So Clinton was, I think, at least helpful in that way.
Thank you. Yes. Right here?
Yes, I have a comment and a footnote. Politicians, as you illustrated, are suspicious by nature. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, to be fair, because I say this with respect to all politicians, good or bad, it's inconceivable that a working politician could devote the kind of concentration that is necessary to make sense out of this case. It just couldn't happen. It's a very complex case, and
but he could delegate others.
He could, yes.
Yes.
Now,
and I think that's true, and I think there's no reason why we should assume that the political leader any more knowledgeable than people in this room. Exactly. And I think Max Holland, who I had lunch with before, I don't know if Max is here, but he would say the same thing. I mean, of course, he's been immersed in the documents on LBJ for his book, and I think, I don't want to speak for Max, but I think he would say, hey, there's no reason why we should put any more credence in what LBJ had to say about the assassination than any of us. But it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you do want to know what your leaders are talking about privately about this.
If I may, too, one other footnote about George H.W. Bush. He had another reason to be interested. His name is in the address book of George de Mohrenschildt, complete with the nickname Poppy, and I've also seen an internal CIA document in which George H.W. Bush's director explains that he has known George de Mohrenschildt since the early 1940s.
Right. Well, obviously, because of his, and because he was running the CIA, he wanted to see how the CIA was being discussed.
If I could just comment on that briefly, there's actually, I think, a much more pertinent point, and that is that according to FBI records on the afternoon of the assassination of George Herbert Walker Bush, phoned in a suspect in the Kennedy assassination. When this emerged later, he couldn't remember having done it. And the CIA ultimately tried to pin it on another George Bush, who Dan Alcorn and I tracked down, and we got an affidavit from him saying no, that he wasn't the person referred to in that memorandum.
So, okay.
The actual story, thank you for reporting on the documents we got on the Freedom of Information case in 1988. Sometimes you don't think anyone pays any attention to these cases, so we appreciate you talking about them. But the actual circumstance was that there was an FBI document that reflects shortly after the assassination that the FBI briefed Mr. George Bush of the CIA about the reaction of the Cuban exile community in Florida to the assassination. And that's what prompted the interest in whether this was George Bush, 41st President of the United States or not. At that point, and we filed our FOIA case. Of course, the CIA generally does not confirm or deny the identity of their agents. In this case, they did publicly release the name of another George Bush that worked for the CIA in 1963, but they did so without contacting him and telling him that his name was about to be released to the media. He was not too happy about that. And we didn't actually interview him, and he said in no way whatsoever was he the person referred to in this FBI memo, because he was a probationary employee at CIA and only worked there a few months. They wouldn't let him even answer the telephone because he was essentially a messenger, a paper delivery man, and he only worked at CIA for 6 months and then moved over to another agency. So that whole issue was left with exactly that fact.
It's reported, by the way, in an article by George McBride in Nation magazine.
Great. Okay. Anybody else?
Mr. Talbot, thank you for your gracious personal reference. I have a question
Yes.
that I wrestled with over the years, and have had the wonderful opportunity speaking briefly on this with Senator Richard Schweiker from my state, talking with George de Mornschild in his living room, and talking with Jim Garrison, and of course all my wonderful colleagues over the years, and testimonies 3 times under oath, Federal Judge Charles Halleck, Rockefeller Commission, the House Select Committee. And I've been involved in politics on this side while I've been devoting full time to the JFK assassination, ignoring my wife and kids and my profession. But I've dabbled a little bit on politics here and there. And used to even be a card-carrying member of the ACLU, although I went with the Skokie incident to push me off the line. Here's a question to you, sir. Given, and I'm a Democrat and past chairman of the Democratic Party in my county and head of the state committee delegation and a member of the Democratic National Committee, that's my political background, okay? Given all of that, given the New York Times and the liberal news media and the left-wing liberal news media in particular, and their problems and concerns and anguish going back and World War II incidents and Koreagate and Watergate and the My Lai scandal, and I've discussed that too with a professional colleague, Henry Rothblatt, Attorney Rothblatt, and all of that, and up through the years, everything. Vincent Foster and Ron Brown and Waco Branch David, and I've been involved in all those cases too as a forensic pathology consultant, and all the way up to Abu Ghraib. Tell me, sir, reasonable people can disagree on the pathology, the radiology, the criminalistics, the photography, the neurosurgery, despite Professor Ron's dismissal, disregard, disrespect, and disembowelment of all these other professions on both sides. My friend, my dear friend and colleague, Michael Bodden, and Henry Lee, even people like Gerald Posner and Vincent Bugliosi, who continue, according to Professor Ron, to just waste our time, all of us on both sides, screwing around here with all of these things. Who gives a shit where the holes are, in or out? You know what Jerry Spence, by the way, or Leslie Bailey would do to Professor Ron in the witness stand? You'd have to bring in kind of a special equipment to pick up the little pieces, the dissection, and to mop up the blood from the floor. That was what happened to him in a murder case, okay? You don't have to worry about any of that stuff. Just ignore it. But tell me this. How is it that we seem to have had over the years more concern, more puzzlement, more disenchantment, a greater cry for reviewing all of this? How is it that recognizing that there are these honest differences of opinion which reasonable people can disagree with in all of these professions, how is it that so early on to the continuing day that the left-wing liberal people who you would have thought, I would have thought, would have seized upon this seeming right-wing conspiracy, whether it did occur or not, and I believe that it did, but whether it did occur, that they had no interest, they just accepted, they had no problem at all on how these things were handled, the autopsy here, the investigation there, the way in which the Warren Commission treated it. They had no problem just reaching out. Everything was clear.
Well, it's a good question. I get where you're going, Cyril.
I would like
okay,
an answer.
I see where you're headed. I think it's a good question, and it's, you know, why? All right. Here's all I can tell you about that. I've wondered about it myself. I come out of a left media background. I was at Mother Jones in the 80s, and now, of course, I started Salon and running Salon, quite clearly a liberal publication. And I've wondered often why left intellectuals, the Noam Chomskys and others, didn't take up the Kennedy investigation as a cause. And Ray Marcus actually enlightened me on this a bit. Some of you are familiar with Ray's monographs, and he's written about this. And when he was living in Boston, I believe it was in the late 60s, he approached Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, among others. There were a couple others as well, I think. And he asked them directly, to look into it. And they rebuffed him, he said. And my feeling is that Kennedy was not a hero to these people, that there is, in certain left-wing circles, a feeling that the Kennedys were cold warriors, that they were trying to get rid of Castro by any means necessary, that even to this day you hear in right-wing circles, there hasn't been a good, tough Democratic president since John Kennedy, meaning, he was willing to kick ass and topple governments and do whatever was necessary for American foreign interests. So I think in some left circles, the Kennedys are anathema. Bobby and Jack both were hardcore cold warriors who didn't deserve to be, supported and protected. Yes, in the back here. Well, I think that's for that reason I just said.
Okay, the reasons, but in August of '63, he signed, at the Cuban Missile Crisis scared the hell out of everybody, including him, and he signed the first nuclear test ban treaty, which I think is what triggered the assassination.
I have your view. I have a different view of the Kennedy administration. I think the Kennedy administration was at war with itself, is my feeling.
He was trying to end the Cold War 40 years before it actually
I think there were two strains within the Kennedy administration. I think they collided. And my sense is that in that collision, you can find some roots of this assassination. I think there were two, as I say, two tracks on Cuba, clearly, we know. That there was a back channel using Bill Atwood, the diplomat at the UN, former journalist, to pursue peace with Castro, at the same time where there was still an aggressive strategy to topple his government. And I think certain people in the hard line felt that the Kennedys had betrayed them. And that's certainly been documented, I think, very well. Right here?
The false linking of Oswald to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and the apparent left-wing credentials of Lee Harvey Oswald, the pro-Castro credentials, and the fact that the left-wing media may have been they closed down the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, the assassination did, and maybe the nation and some of the left-wing media felt so grateful for having been let off the hook. Remember, we're coming right out of the McCarthy era. And it looked like a McCarthy era was dawning. Then when they confined everything to the strange precincts of Oswald's psyche, the left-wing media may have heaved a sigh of relief. Is that possible?
That's getting into an area that I'm afraid I don't have much expertise on. I think, though, it's a fascinating subject. What the left-wing media did on the investigation, on the assassination in the 60s, you have to look at Warren Hinkle and Ramparts, who in some ways was the one of my early inspirations as a California journalist. And I think Warren Hinkle with Bill Turner did some interesting work on the assassination. So I don't think all the left-wing media decided that, screw the Kennedys, who cares if they were killed. But I think that was, an attitude in some doctrinaire left circles.
Another question about left circles is the issue of JFK in Vietnam. There were a series of exchanges John Newman wrote in letters in two articles that were originally published by Alex Coburn in The Nation. And after Alex Coburn gave up the issue of JFK in Vietnam, Max Holland here took it up, arguing that it was a fantasy that Jack Kennedy was not going to have Americanized the war. Well, now we have David Kaiser, who's sitting in the audience here, who has spent many, many long years in the files, and Howard Jones, who published on Oxford University Press, published book called The Death of a Generation, in which I won't paraphrase David Kaiser, but I will paraphrase David Jones because he's not here, and he can't blame me when I get it wrong. But he says that when he first heard the idea that Kennedy wasn't going to Americanize the war, he thought that was a silly idea. And essentially the reason he apparently wrote this book, or a strong motivation for it, was that when he actually looked at the files, the evidence that Kennedy was not going to Americanize the war was so overwhelming that he had to write the book to basically atone for his serious misperception. You will not hear that in the nation. You'll never hear a correction of that in the nation, and nor will you hear that generally in left-wing circles, despite the fact that I think that it's overwhelmingly now the view of most people who know this information that Jack Kennedy was clearly
Yeah, well, you
against
will
doing
in
that.
Salon. I think the work, my own work, Sid Blumenthal's work, Jamie Galbraith, others have, I think, a more benign a view of the Kennedy administration and think that it was grappling its way towards, I think, a rethinking of the Cold War before it was terminated. But I do think there were definitely conflicting forces within the Kennedy administration, a hardline force and a more progressive force, symbolized by Theodore Sorensen, among others, Ted Sorensen, who wrote the American University speech. And I think Jim's getting the hook.
Yeah, we have a short break scheduled, and then we're going to have an absolutely fascinating program the rest of the afternoon, which hopefully will match what David Talbot has done, and I think it will. Thank you, David. One quick announcement from that is
Could the following speakers and panelists please be Feynman, McKnight, Morley, Robertson, Talbot, and Levy. And also just to remind you, the archives are open until 7 today, and Cindy, if you'd like to go to tomorrow.
Here's what's ahead on C-SPAN.